everyone, and welcome to Gravitas, the show where we look beyond the headlines to bring you an in-depth analysis of the day's big stories. I'm your host, Aisha Sindhu. The big talking point tonight: President Donald Trump has, in the past, admitted to being a fan of nuclear energy. Now, the civil nuclear market in the United States is agog with speculation that he is all set to revive the industry. What will this mean for India, especially keeping in mind President Trump's relative silence on the Indo-US nuclear deal? To talk more about the implications of these developments, I'm joined in the studio by WION Senior Editor Padma Rao. Also joining us are two very special guests. Raymond E. Vickery Jr. is here with us. He is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Trade Development in the Bill Clinton government. Currently, he's also a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in D.C. He's also a much-sought advisor on U.S.-India relations, which is why he's right here on Gravitas. He's played a leading role in the U.S.'s action of lifting sanctions against India and the passage of the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal.
Also here with us is Ambassador Sham Saran, equally sought after. He is a former Foreign Secretary of India, tenure during which he was appointed the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Indo-US civil nuclear issues. Later, he was also India's Special Envoy and Chief Negotiator on climate change. Ambassador Saran, too, is credited with making a significant contribution to the Indo-US nuclear deal. And Ambassador Saran is also the chairman, or was the chairman, of the National Security Council Advisory Board till least recently, and he's much sought after, as I said, on many gremiums.
All right, before we get to all the talking, and believe me, we've got lots lined up for you on the program, we're going to turn our attention to really what's brought Trump and nuclear energy back into focus. Now, the U.S. President's silence on the India-US civil nuclear agreement has raised some eyebrows here in India. The Trump campaign came up with a 35-page booklet on an issue, linking it to money being paid to the Hillary Clinton camp by the Indian politician Amar Singh. More details in this report.
Be very concerned. I'm in favor of nuclear energy, very strongly in favor of nuclear energy.
That comment on Fox News was made 6 years ago, when Trump was nowhere on the presidential horizon. Today, the civil nuclear power market in the US is abuzz with speculation that Trump is all set to revive the industry. Media reports say Trump's transition team has talked to the Energy Department about ways to keep more nuclear power plants running. But Trump's silence on the India-US civil nuclear agreement has raised eyebrows. He raised the matter only indirectly last year when his election campaign issued a 35-page booklet accusing Hillary Clinton of receiving millions of dollars in funds from Samajwadi Party leader Amar Singh to support the agreement. India has two advantages. It set up an insurance pool to overcome objections by US nuclear power companies concerned about the tough liabilities they would have to incur in the event of an accident. And there's the fact that the agreement was initiated by George Bush, a Republican president. Bureau Report, WION.
Let's go straight into the discussion with our guests. My first question is to Mr. Raymond Vickery. May I call you Ray?
Please do.
Ray, President Donald Trump has outlined an energy policy on his website, and in it he says, and I quote, "American energy dominance," that's in quotes, "is a strategic and economic policy goal of the United States." What could he possibly mean by that?
Well, you know, our new president is given to some hyperbole in regard to these matters. America first, in protectionism to be able to produce the kind of economic growth that he's talked about. So I don't think you ought to take that dominance business, particularly in regard to energy, too seriously. What I do think he's talking about is that he's very much interested in fossil fuel as well as in renewables, which, as you know, the Obama administration is very much concentrated on. So he wants to see a continuation of the kind of fracking and boom that we've had there. On nuclear matters, I think that he wants to see some revival. Now, the fact is that energy policy in the United States is like a great ocean liner. You don't move it very fast from one place to the other. Companies already have their plans in place. I think the good news is that what it indicates for U.S.-India relations on civil nuclear, on fossil fuels, oil and gas, as well as renewables, is that there is a greater opportunity for cooperation across the board. Now, Ambassador Saran and I worked long and hard to get the civil nuclear deal through. There have been hang-ups in regard to liability questions in terms of the commercial activity. The one thing that President Trump does know how to do is how to make a deal. And so I think that the deal in regard to civil nuclear is there. It's obvious advantage to both sides, and I expect it'll receive new impetus.
Okay, I'm going to segue out of you bringing up that the Indo-US civil nuclear deal. Ambassador Saran, you were the PM's special envoy in 2008 when this deal was finally signed. Now we're in 2017, the year's just begun, and there's not a single atomic reactor by the United States brought to India. The deal's full potential remains unrealized. Why do you see that?
As you know, we had several issues relating to the civil liability bill, which the US government to begin with, but also the most important players in the nuclear industry, like Westinghouse, for example, or General Electric, for example, they had great reservations about what the implications, commercial implications of the liability bill would be. But as far as the two governments are concerned, you recall that the civil liability bill issue was resolved between the governments during President Obama's visit to India. So as far as the two governments are concerned, there is really no issue as such. Insurance pool has been set up in order to take care of whatever reservations some of the companies may have. So as far as governments are concerned, the road is clear for commercial deals to be actually achieved. What my understanding is that since that matter has been resolved between the two sides, both Westinghouse and General Electric actually have been in conversation with NPCIL, which is the Nuclear Power Corporation of India. And, any deals of this kind require a considerable amount of negotiation on various terms and conditions. So that is the stage where we are at. I have no reason to believe that we would not be able to actually move forward. Yes, you are completely right that there has been a delay. But don't forget that the whole environment with respect to nuclear energy has, since Fukushima, has in fact become somewhat negative. So we also have to move forward while we are doing these deals to really respond to some of the very genuine concerns that people have with regard to the safety of nuclear power and whether or not it is really going to be an answer to India's energy security requirements.
Sure. So keeping in mind recent developments, is also important to look at the delay under that lens as well. So Mr. Vikri, to you now. The India-US strategic partnership has become so strong of late and only been strengthened with the Obama-Modi relationship. Is it right for us to then think that a mere change in governance on either side would not be enough to sort of change the track or change the policy when it comes to something as important as the civil nuclear partnership?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And the really good news about U.S.-India relations, and particularly in these troubled times, is that I can tell you from personal experience, and I'm sure the Ambassador Saran can vouch for this, that there is strong bipartisan support in the United States. Whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, there is a broad recognition that India and the United States are the two greatest democracies in the world. And if we can't cooperate on these issues, whether they be energy, civil nuclear, whether they be terrorism, whether they be a hegemon in Asia, then there's very little hope. So I am very much optimistic that what we have seen, the progress that we saw between Modi and Obama, is going to be continued in regard to Modi and Trump. It's going to take a lot of activity, though. This is not a relationship which is on autopilot, that has hundreds of years of kinds of history behind it, so that automatically things happen. What it takes is for men and women of goodwill, particularly in the Congress and in the Parliament, to recognize this. I can't tell you how many times I have been to think tank kinds of seminars in the United States, and they talk about, well, what are the greatest opportunities for the United States?
Sure.
And the U.S.-India relationship is not mentioned. That's what I'm working to turn around, and I'm sure that there are people on this side who are doing the same thing in India.
Right. You mentioned autopilot. I think, President Trump seems right now to be anything but on autopilot. He seems to be zigzagging all over the place on his own. But coming to you, Ambassador Saran, our public protests, just to come back to the delay that my colleague Aisha was mentioning, we've had public protests in places like Kalpakkam and Kudangulam in Tamil Nadu. One of the reasons, are such protests one of the reasons for these delays, and is there any substance to these protests?
It is very important that when there are protests of this kind, we should try and see why people are protesting. So when you have, like it happened with Fukushima, those scenes which are played on your television sets inside your homes, I think we should recognize that there is enough cause for people to be worried, people to have anxiety. It is another matter that as far as India's nuclear power plants are concerned, actually our safety record is one of the best in the world. And it is not the Department of Atomic Energy saying this. This is the World Nuclear Power Operators Association, which does due diligence, which has actually stated that these are some of the best managed nuclear power plants in the world. So the Department of Atomic Energy has every reason to feel that these protests perhaps are not taking into account, the record that we have. Right. However, it is important for the government, it is important for the Department of Nuclear Energy not to dismiss these, anxieties, but to respond to them, to explain to people what are the costs, what are the benefits. If you compare it with other sources of energy, actually the record of nuclear energy is probably one of the best. After all, you had a explosion of the offshore gas fields of the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
I know that was a major accident. So it is, every source of energy has risks, but it has benefits also, and nuclear energy is no different. So I think it is important for us to recognize that these protests have been held. There is genuine anxiety behind that, and an effort should be made to respond to those anxieties, giving people the facts, telling them what. So your question, has this delayed matters? Yes, it has, to the extent that any responsible government would want to review safety features, would want to make certain that the kind of accident which took place in Fukushima, that something like that would not happen.
Still, Ambassador Saran, just to persist, on that point, I completely see your point, but we have this sort of cynicism in our country, I think, which many of us share with any public sector projects. We've had bridges collapsing during the Commonwealth Games, freshly built bridges. So there is a certain cynicism about anything that is built by the government, maintained by the government. But then, the most advanced nations have had nuclear reactor accidents, like in Fukushima in Japan. So the protests and fears of, those thousands of people who live close to these nuclear reactors, they must be surely justified in some way.
Well, justified because, as I said, when you see those kind of scenes, even if that has not happened in India, there is enough to cause a great deal of worry, right? So my point is that you need to respond to that. Treat those protests, treat those anxieties as being genuine concerns, which you have to respond to as a responsible government in a democracy. But what I'm also saying is that you need to do that reassurance by also pointing out to the fact, despite the cynicism that you are talking about, that the record of the nuclear power plants built in India is actually quite good, taking into account the international experience. And as I said, we may be cynical about what the our own regulators say or the government says, but hopefully we will not be cynical about the fact that an internationally recognized agency is also saying the same thing.
Ambassador, pardon me, Mr. Vikri, I just wanted to, take the discussion a little bit further on the specific Indo-US nuclear deal. Now, the first commercial agreement between the two countries is slated for June 2017, which is the year we're in now. Why do you think it's taken almost 10 years for the signing of that, since the signing of that nuclear deal, for this to come through?
Well, as the ambassador has pointed out, we did have these liability issues. Then we've had really plain old commercial kinds of issues. I often think that India needs to take its nuclear program and move a little bit more toward a U.S. Use of private sector, and probably the United States needs to move a little bit more toward public sector, because there has been a clash and really misunderstanding in terms of how this would work. I want to pick up on this point that was made by Ambassador Sarin in regard to the safety issue, because that's obviously of great issue to those who live near a plant. But it is not just the big kinds of problems you have when you have a BP blowout in the Gulf Coast. The fact is that if you burn coal or biomass, you have millions of women who are affected by that in terms of their own health and dying prematurely. So the idea that there is some sort of pristine energy source which doesn't have any risks or any problems is just not true.
Right.
It's going to take a mix, and I'm convinced that civil nuclear is a part of that.
Okay, so a mix, not just in private and public, but something that India is doing is also looking at a diversification of its sources of energy. So we actually have a report up on that. I'm going to ask my production room if they can pull that up for us, because India's growing energy demands have prompted a sort of diversification of sources of energy. Now, let's also take a look at this nuclear deal timeline. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and the U.S. President George W. Bush agreed in principle to a landmark civil nuclear cooperation deal. Right. Let's move on. Now, in December 2006, the U.S. Congress overwhelmingly approved the deal. President Bush signed the bill into law. But in July 2007, the two countries announced a finalization of the deal after months of tough negotiations on a bilateral pact. Now, text of that bilateral pact, called the 123 Agreement, and was unveiled simultaneously in both countries. Over in July 2008, India submitted a draft Nuclear Safeguards Accord to the IAEA governors for approval. Then, August of the same year, the governors of the IAEA approved the US nuclear deal. And just a month later, Nuclear Suppliers Group approved that nuclear deal, clearing key international hurdles, and the US House of Representatives approved the deal. In October 2008, the US Congress approved this landmark deal.
So we're back in the discussion again, and I'd like to ask Ray, start with you, Ray. Mr. Trump seems determined, President Trump, to overturn everything his predecessor, President Barack Obama, and the Democrats did. The nuclear deal, though, was signed by his own fellow Republican, President Bush, George W. Bush. But Trump, there was some talk of President Trump accusing Hillary Clinton of accepting a bribe from an Indian minister, ostensibly as a donation for the Clinton Foundation. In exchange, it is charged for support for President Bush's Indo-US nuclear deal. He's said this several times during his campaign run. So will that, not this incident, but are a series of incidents likely to influence just his determination to overturn everything that the Democrats did? Is that likely to play a role in how he treats the Indo-US nuclear deal?
I don't think so. President Trump said a lot of things in the campaign about Hillary Clinton. He was going to lock her up, and all of this was going to take place, and that hasn't taken place. And hopefully we are reaching a point where we're getting past the hyperbole of a campaign. And I think those of you in India understand about things being said in campaigns that don't exactly reflect reality. The fact is that this deal was signed under George W. Bush, was a premier part of the Bush legacy, and it's something which has had broad bipartisan support like a lot of the rest of the relationship. So I don't think that that kind of allegation is going to play a role. A bigger role will be played in just plain old commercial terms. The fact is, capital costs have to come to grips. Also, I would like to point out that we shouldn't be just concentrating on what happens with Westinghouse and GE, the big general contractors, if you will. There is a whole value chain in the United States of people who work in the nuclear industry. And one of the things which I think was going to happen is that in addition to the big kinds of plant shovel in the ground, there's going to be with if you will, a loosening up of the controls which have been very strong in India to allow these kinds of private sector actors to get involved in the Indian nuclear industry. Because quite frankly, our entire energy scenario in the United States is flat. Mm-hmm. We aren't going to be consuming a lot more energy, and it's really because of efficiency. But the growth, whether it be in nuclear, whether it be in oil and gas, whether it be in renewables, is in India and in the non-OECD parts of Asia. Right. And so that's going to fuel a lot of interest if we can have the foresight to be able to take advantage of this window of opportunity.
Right. Ambassador Saran, you know, I was thinking about what we were chatting a little while ago, and you were talking about the mix of energy, different sources of energy that India has. Now, just coming back to these public protests, you know, by anti-nuclear activists, I will concede, though, that the capacity of Indian reactors has gone up from 79% in 2010-2011 to a 97% capacity in at least 9 out of our 20 Indian reactors just a year later. And, you know, this has reflected also in the production of power. I mean, we're all feeling it, which has improved significantly. And the goal, of course, is to triple that nuclear energy production by 2024. But given the energy mix, you know, since we were speaking of energy mixes, the energy mix that Prime Minister Modi is specifically aiming for, which also includes a large part of renewable energies, and, you know, the government has invested, as you know, quite aggressively in that sector. Is this possible?
Two things. One, you pointed out to the improved capacity in the nuclear power plants. A reason for that is also because of the Indo-US nuclear deal, which then later on was in a sense universalized with the waiver which we got from the nuclear suppliers group. This has enabled us to actually enter into long-term fuel supply agreements with a whole host of countries. Because what was really leading to low capacity utilization in our nuclear power plants was just simply a shortage of fuel. Mm-hmm. So today we don't have a fuel constraint. Mm. So even when we are talking about the future, that is our ability to be able to add significantly to capacity, this is going to be a very important element, that we do not anymore have a constraint in terms of fuel supply. So this is a very key element. Secondly, one must also be mindful of the fact that nuclear energy was never meant to be somehow a replacement for other sources of energy. Right. Even by 2030-31, when we said we would have something like 63,000 megawatts of nuclear power, that would have been only 10% of the projected total energy requirements in 2030-31. So we are looking at nuclear energy as a part and parcel of a cleaner energy future, not looking at it as somehow the panacea for all our energy requirements.
Certainly, Ambassador Saran, I appreciate that. But, I mean, we all know that we're a very, very rapidly developing economy. We're talking about heavy industry. Heavy industry certainly does need larger
but
sources
today
of...
your problem is that you have surplus power.
Right.
So, while I concede the point that we need a lot of energy and we need the energy from any source that we can get, but currently actually our power supply is more than what our demand is, and that is why we are actually exporting power to Bangladesh, we are exporting power to Nepal. So we also need to do some balancing in the meantime. But yes, for the future, as I said, nuclear energy is going to be a very important component of our energy security. Not only energy security, but also the climate change challenge.
Sure.
So, because it is clean energy. So, I think we have to look at it in a broader perspective, that we must, as we try to develop other sources of energy, this is going to be a very key and significant aspect of how we go about meeting both the energy security challenge as well as the climate change challenge.
Okay, so clean energy and the security challenge being met as part of looking at nuclear energy as part of a larger...
yes, it has to be part and parcel of a larger energy strategy.
Sure. And I'm glad you brought that up, because we do have that report ready for our viewers now, because India's growing energy demands, as the ambassador was pointing out, has prompted it to diversify on its sources of energy. Now, this next report looks at where exactly India derives energy for its booming population from, and how that blueprint might change in the coming days. Take a look.
A growing population and a booming economy have meant that India's energy requirements are on the rise. The country today is the world's third largest energy consumer, despite per capita energy consumption being well below the world average. Government figures as of September last year show that India has a total installed power capacity of just over 300,000 megawatts. Out of this, thermal energy from coal, gas, diesel and so on accounts for the largest chunk. This is followed by hydropower and then renewable sources such as solar and wind energy, along with small hydro projects and biomass projects. Nuclear energy, meanwhile, accounts for merely a fraction of India's energy basket. In the years to come, however, this mix is likely to undergo a dramatic change. Already, the government plans to expand solar power capacity to 100,000 megawatts by 2022. Moreover, it has pledged to achieve 40% of its cumulative electric power capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy resources by 2030. Such a commitment has led to estimates of a boom in demand for energy from renewables. For instance, the BP Energy Outlook 2035 predicts that India's total energy consumption is expected to grow by 128% by 2035.